Thank you so much, Mr. Masvi, for this insightful talk, and I'm sure there will be more questions or many questions about risk mitigation measures with regards to energy development. And this Barents 2020 project is a wonderful example of cooperation and the process of harmonization of standards, industrial standards, health and safety standards, which are very important. Our next speaker is Dr. Betsy Baker, and sorry, I'll just. Dr. Betsy Baker is Associate Professor, Vermont Law School, and she's also a Senior Fellow for Oceans and Energy at the school's Institute for Energy and the Environment. Dr. Baker has published widely on law and regulation in the Arctic, including topics such as law of the sea, oil and gas regulation, sea ice, marine scientific research, transboundary regulatory cooperation. She has also written white papers on related topics for a wide range of users, including the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Arctic Council. She was co-lead author of the PAMI Arctic Ocean Review Phase 2 report, which was adopted this May in Karuna Ministerial Meeting of the Arctic Council. She was a member of science crew on U.S. icebreaker Halley, on Arctic Ocean Extended Continental Shelf Mapping from 2008 to 2009, and also served as a visiting scholar with the U.S. Extended Continental Shelf Task Force at the U.S. Department of State, Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs. Dr. Baker has a GD from Michigan, a master's and doctoral degrees from Christian Albrechts University in Kiel, Germany, where she was also an Alexander von Humboldt Chancellor Scholar. She's going to talk to us today about oil and gas specific outcomes from the Karuna Ministerial Meeting of the Arctic Council, and she will also mention developments in Alaska. Dr. Baker, floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I'm really delighted to see how our presentations complement each other. I will be touching on some of the points on Barents 2020 as I go. And today really we'll be focusing more on the policy level than the legal side of things, and want to do so from my background as an international and comparative law person. In that capacity, I had the opportunity to participate in the mapping of the U.S. continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean on 2 cruises, which is what this first picture shows. And the reason I put it up here is to help us think about each of our concrete experiences where we may have been involved in some of the issues we're talking about today, to help us understand risk reduction. So 2 icebreakers traveling together to help us think about cooperation as well. In this picture, you see the Canadian icebreaker, the Louis Saint Laurent, up front, breaking ice unusually for the U.S. icebreaker. We were carrying on the U.S. icebreaker the bathymetric mapping gear, and the seismic was on the Canadian icebreaker. And right there, an example of sharing resources, complementing each other's technical skills, sharing not only the icebreakers and the ice pilots, but sharing the scientific team, the years and years of experience that come together in an undertaking that all 5 Arctic coastal states are engaged in. Things like the helicopter, as we saw in our presentations this morning. This photo is taken from the Canadian helicopter. The U.S. did not have one on its icebreaker. So in remote locations, how do you share resources? How do you ensure greater safety, backup? And how do you work in your neighborhood? And that may seem a colloquial term, but I want to return to that idea as I begin to talk about some of the things that we heard just now about the Barents neighborhood, if you will. What are standards that are applicable there? So with that as background, let me just give you a quick, maybe not, there we go, overview of what I will be discussing today. And I'll handle the Alaska component in the question and answer session, given the time limitations that we have. So we're all aware of the Karuna meeting of the Ministers of the Arctic Council, and I'll start talking about their declaration and then delve into some of the work of the individual working groups of the Arctic Council and how their outcomes at the Karuna Ministerial addressed oil and gas issues. And I'll touch briefly on prospects for international standards sharing and harmonization. I will not be speaking about the Arctic Oil Spill Preparedness and Response Agreement, as the next speaker will be going into quite a bit of detail on that. And as an international lawyer, I have to point out that it's not an Arctic Council agreement per se. It was negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council, but it was still very much the states who signed it and the states who negotiated it. But it is a good example of the Arctic Council's growing ability to serve as a convening forum, and that is not an insignificant power, if you will. So the Karuna Declaration has a very specific reference, and Minister Borby already referred to the establishment of the task force to develop an Arctic Council action plan on prevention. We'll hear in a moment about the agreement on preparedness and response, but that did not include the prevention question. And those outcomes will be available at the next ministerial meeting. And again, I leave it to Ambassador Vasilyev to go into more detail on that. A primer, I know many of you are familiar with the Arctic Council, but some are not. And just to remind everybody of the working groups that are established, my experience has been with the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group. But the EPPR, Emergency Prevention, Preparedness, and Response, are also quite active in the oil and gas area, and AMAP, because of its monitoring role, also looks at some oil and gas issues. I would point out that the SDWG, the Sustainable Development Working Group, is has approved of this activity that we're engaged in this week as an important component of its work. And indeed, they convened the first Arctic Energy Summit. And so we're trying to provide some feedback to that working group today, or at the end of our conference this week. And oil and gas, I think, will be a significant outcome, or a significant component of what we reflect back to them from our conversations. So Minister Borby also very helpfully provided us some background on what has happened already in the Arctic Council on oil and gas. And he focused on the 2004 Arctic Marine Strategic Plan. That's in the decadal update, and we will expect a revised version of that in the coming calendar year, and look forward to that. And I'm just going to not read them all for you, but to give you the sense that the Arctic Council has produced very concrete outcomes when it comes to oil and gas. The oil and gas assessment was already mentioned today, guidelines for how you transfer those hydrocarbon products, operational guidelines for the agreement that we'll be hearing about on oil spill preparedness. And the Arctic Council offshore oil and gas guidelines, which Mr. Borby also went into some detail on today, is a good example. They offer a good example of how the national systems, the national legal and regulatory systems, interact with what's going on in the Arctic Council. That allows me to reiterate again as a lawyer that what the Arctic Council produces is not law. The Arctic Council produces scientific studies, it produces consultations and provides forums for regulators from the different countries to come together. And in fact, the 2009 Arctic Offshore Oil and Gas Guidelines are an excellent example of regulators from the involved states sharing their experiences on what they understand as best practices in their respective countries and coming up with the best result, if you will. And that allows me to just really provide you the information that you see on the screen here about 2 ongoing projects of the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group. And those are one on health, safety, and environment management systems, very much in the performance-based side of things as opposed to the prescriptive that we just heard about. And then another workshop on safety culture. And this is where, without worrying about the political concerns in each regulatory system, the regulators and other experts can sit down and compare, again, best practices. For the HSE, the Health, Safety, and Environment Management Report, what those regulators and other experts are doing in an Arctic Council informal working setting is taking about 30 indicators from the different national systems that they use to measure health, safety, and environment outcomes. Comparing them, it's not quite a Barents 2020 type of project, but does allow, again, that kind of cross-cultural exchange, if you will. And that will be coming out at the end of this year. I want to focus just on the Arctic Ocean Review very briefly. I had the privilege of being a co-lead author on this survey of all of the international agreements that are relevant to to the Arctic Ocean generally. And it had 8 chapters. Oil and gas was just one of them. You can see the other topics listed there: fisheries, indigenous peoples and cultures, shipping, marine pollution, etc. But the oil and gas recommendations, which are a negotiated set of recommendations, so they don't necessarily look like what the scientific experts first recommended, talk about the need both to standardize and to harmonize. And I want to emphasize on the standardization point. This was something that was also just mentioned in the previous presentation. Don't duplicate the work or the research of other groups that are out there, but try to complement each other. So the states and the Arctic Council aren't going to be setting up their own standards. They don't have the authority to do that, but they are encouraging their members to work through the existing organizations to come up with Arctic appropriate standards and programs. Harmonization is not a question of all 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states having identical rules and regulations, but trying to figure out where it makes the most sense to do things in a similar way. And it may not make sense to have the same ice management standards for all 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states, but rather to work, again, in a neighborhood basis, as Norway and Russia are doing in the Barents Project. Another very clear recommendation that is true not only for oil and gas coming out of the Karuna Ministerial is the need to engage industry more. That has not been done to the level it should have, I guess I'll say, in the Arctic Council. Oil and gas producers and the International Association of Drilling Contractors, of course, have their organizational observer status, and working with them to try to figure out ways to engage more with industry, since that is the group that has the expertise to help think about standardizing and harmonizing. And then finally, interaction not only with industry, but there are a lot of relevant international treaties applicable to the Arctic Ocean. And how can the Arctic Council help encourage those treaty bodies to speak to each other in a way that saves effort, doesn't duplicate it, and comes out with some very practical outcomes? I'm going to talk about that last point. How do we have, and this again is my primary experience in international law, how do we get different actors to talk to each other with practical results? So just a very brief example of how the Arctic Council is already interacting with treaty bodies, with which you may be familiar, on sort of the other side of things, the Arctic Council being in the non-binding realm and the international treaties and agreements being in the binding realm. So to take as my first example, the protection of the Arctic marine environment does have informal interactions with the OSPAR Convention, the Oslo-Paris Convention on the prevention of the protection of the Northeast Atlantic marine environment. Not all 8 Arctic states are party, but enough of them are that we have some good practices that others in the Arctic Council might look to. And the OSPAR Treaty also has a very robust working group on offshore industry. And that offshore industry committee has a very active Arctic subgroup. One of the very first region under that treaty is the Arctic. And so PAIM is participating in those discussions with the OIC. That's one way that an Arctic Council working group can learn from and provide expertise to an existing international agreement. The Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program has a fairly formal observer status with OSPAR, and through that, if you gather from the name of that working group, Monitoring and Assessment, it is connecting with what OSPAR has done very well, its Joint Assessment and Monitoring Program, where it has established uniform protocols for gathering environmental data in all of its member states. So again, trying to figure out how do we get that type of exchange of information and experience and expertise to produce some concrete outcomes. Another very briefly, an example from the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna working groups. They worked very directly through a formal memorandum of agreement with the Convention on Biological Diversity and produced a truly outstanding report, the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, which was presented also at the Karuna Ministerial. So those are just some examples of how the AC working groups can engage with treaty bodies and not recreate the wheel, so to speak. To build further on that concrete example, what does that have to do with oil and gas, you may ask? One of the recommendations from that biodiversity assessment was to mainstream biodiversity in whatever the Arctic Council does and encourage the Arctic Council to do that also as it interacts with other treaty bodies and other states. And so even in offshore or also in offshore oil and gas operations, to think about how we can pull biodiversity concerns into that. And oil spill response certainly would be one way to do that. I am not an EPPR expert, but will only highlight what we already heard about this morning, that there is the RP3 report, for those of you who would like to study it more closely, a reminder of the name and can provide access to that. Looking at best practices which aim at completely eliminating the potential for accidental releases. As we've just heard, zero risk is not entirely possible, but that's what they're aiming best practices at. And they're also providing non-binding operational guidelines to the agreement we'll hear about briefly in a moment. Part of that RP3, again, just to give you some concrete examples of the kind of things coming out of the working group, catalog those standards so that we can compare across regions, facilitate research, facilitate regulatory cooperation. What about a joint database for Arctic Ocean coastal state regulators? What about allowing them to share best practices and near-miss data? Well, with the near-miss data, you might run into problems with the existing regulatory regimes in each country where there might be a disincentive to share that type of information that we really could benefit from. And just to point out that it's not only the Arctic Council that's calling for standardization. After the Macondo incident, our Presidential Commission called for global best practices. I want to take it from global to neighborhood and thinking about regional or neighborhood standardization. So we've heard a lot about the remarkable Barents 2020 project. Perhaps we could think of the same type of project for Russia and the United States, a Chukchi 2025, or for Canada and the United States, a Beaufort 2025, and just begin to think about what's appropriate to each region. I won't go into that detail, but the detail of this slide, but it just shows you how, on one simple question, how do you winterize facilities across the 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states? You have very different approaches to that. And I'd be glad to make this available for those of you who actually want to read it in any detail. And each state is going to have its own requirements, but why don't we at least get them talking to each other about what might be appropriate. In conclusion, we were asked to think about resilience, richness, and responsibility. And I'm not sure I have a lot of detail on that, but the responsibility, the richness, I think, in my experience is that we do have a lot of, whether you're talking about a scientific cruise or an industry cruise, a lot of opportunity to share Arctic experiences from those types of undertakings, a lot of common brain power, if you will. The responsibility, I think, is to come up with ways to share that, to have incentives for sharing that will also produce the economic outputs that the industry is interested in. I will leave it to our discussion to talk more about those three categories, but would like to thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.